All right, we'll get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Mesa City Council study session for June 1st, 2023. We have Councilmember Summers and Councilmember Spilsbury are unable to attend this morning and they are excused. We also have the mayor, Councilmember Duff, and Councilmember Goforth attending via Zoom. Good morning. And then Councilmember Freeman and myself are here in person. We have a couple items on the agenda. The first item is to review and discuss items on the two agendas we have for June 5th, and those agendas are for a regular council meeting and a special council meeting. Are there any questions or either on these agendas from the council? I know we have a couple presentations.
Yes, Vice Mayor, we do. And specifically for this agenda, if you'd like, we could come forward and do the presentation for 5B on the public safety personnel retirement system. Would you like to have that presented now?
Yes.
Okay. Sam?
All right.
Good morning,
Good morning.
Mayor, Council. All right, good morning. My name is Samuel Schultz. I am the Deputy Director for the Office of Management and Budget, and we're coming back to you as our annual presentation on the PSPRS pension funding policy. So each year we come before you with our pension funding policy. Due to state statute, we are required to come and meet with council and have council adopt a funding policy and formally accept the current liabilities and assets of the system for the tier 1 and tier 2 that we have been working to pay down. So with our pension funding policy, we have three main objectives that we are required to meet with it. The first one is to maintain stability of contributions. We do this through a pension stabilization fund that we set aside $2 million each year to then allow the city to react to hard times due to investment returns that we receive from PSPRS. At this year, we're expected to have that stabilization fund be around $14 million. We also look to maintain and we forecast out our reserve balances of our funds when we do our general governmental forecast as well as our city forecast in an 8-year model. We looked at we can maintain these stable contributions throughout that forecast, ensure that the city is financially stable to maintain those contributions and meet the requirements of PSPRS. The second is to meet the funding requirements. This one, as we kind of discuss, what we require, though we have switched over to a stable contribution that we look to minimize the fluctuations in our forecast, we also require ourselves to at least meet the minimum of the actuarial contribution that is required through PSPRS. We are contributing above and beyond that arc, but for the funding policy, we at least require ourselves to meet that actuarial contribution. And then the last would be the funding ratio target and timeline. So the city, a few years ago, we readjusted our funding timeline. We went from a 20-year with PSPRS to a 30-year, and the city adopted a policy to pay off that amortization over a 25-year. The city is not into the 19th year of that amortization, so we have 19 years to pay down that pension to meet 100% funded status, and that year would then be by June 30th of 2042. So this slide presents our current assets and liabilities. So you'll see the assets and liabilities from last year and the change into this fiscal year. The next slide will go into a couple changes with what PSPRS has done to the system. But as you can see, our funded status has improved. We did increase for fire and medical up to 52%, and for police, we increased up to 49.6%. you will see that the assets and the liabilities have increased, so our unfunded liability has increased to 732 million, but our assets are growing at a faster rate, around 9.8%, comparatively to our liability that's growing at a 6.7%. There have been some changes that is causing that liability to increase more than we expected, but we'll go into that a little bit into the next slide. So a couple updates on this pension plan. Some of the causes that is increasing this liability is we are seeing higher than expected salary growth in our actuals. So as you all are aware, we did the salary adjustments, and we are projecting to do another salary adjustment coming into next year. So that growth of salary is increasing our liabilities, because as we increase those salaries, it's going to be a larger payout to those employees when they get to retirement. So that is growing at a faster percentage than what the model projects out at. So for this last fiscal year of 21-22, we had a projected growth of around 10%. The second change was the discount rate, or the investment growth. This was reduced on PSPRS's side from what their projected target was of the 7.3% down to 7.2%. So what that decrease does is it decreases into our forecast the amount of revenue growth that we would have on our fund balance, which now decreases the amount of assets we have into that forecast. So by reducing that, it furthers our gap of our unfunded liability. And lastly, the investment returns. Last year was not a good year from investment returns for PSPRS for the Tier 1, Tier 2. We had approximately a return of negative 4.2%. One thing to note on that is with PSPRS, we do amortize and smooth out those losses. So we did have a larger investment growth in the prior fiscal year, around that 27%. But with this negative 4.2%, it did wipe out those losses, those gains from that prior year. So we're back in the position that we were prior to that growth. For this fiscal year, we are projecting PSPRS investment returns to be around only 1% to 2% after fees are removed. So that's something that we're projecting into the forecast. And when we get to the funded status slide, we'll kind of go into what we're also projecting out from a future standpoint. But one thing to think about as we go into the slide is we are looking into next year, projecting a mild recession as well with what our general budget forecast was as well. So that would compound almost 3 years of missed investment returns. So from the city funded strategies, so as we talked about in that initial slide for the objectives, we do have that pension stabilization fund that we do the $2 million annual contribution. For the close of fiscal year 22-23, we are projecting that to be around $14 million. The other thing with these increases, so as we take into account the salary increases as well as the employee increases, so for the adopted budget, we're adding additional positions on fire for the stations. We're adding the positions for the medic program. We're adding police positions through the public safety sales tax. So as we increase those FTE, increase those salaries for the proposed market rate, include the marijuana, our adjusted contribution of that stabilized contribution will now be forecasted around 86 to 88 million. So we are recommending that we adjust those bounds based upon these changes that are occurring to then account for the changes in the market to the 80 to 90 million. So for our outlook, as we talked about, the city of Mesa is projecting a mild recession coming into 23-24. Other things that we're looking out for is the federal debt ceiling discussions, because that can have an impact onto the market. We did see some news last night with the Congress passing it and moving it on to the Senate. So hopefully we will see minimized effects on that, but something that we'll still kind of continue to monitor as changes from the federal government can impact what the market will be doing. Other thing to remember is pension is a long-term plan, so we will have ups and downs. So we're talking about a fund that we're trying to bring to 100% funded over a 19-year amortization period. So we do amortize and we do smooth things out over that 7 years. So we will see ups and downs throughout this forecast. But we do have to monitor and adjust for the changes that could occur and impact that liability. So that's the second point that we have on there, is to continue to monitor changes from the state. Each year, legislation does bring up new bills that could affect the PSPRS liability, whether it's to improve or increase that liability. With the latest year, we did have House Bill 2028, which did change the contribution rate of Tier 2 and reduce that down to 7.65. But then that did give us the ability to recognize additional assets that we will get a change in our actuarial valuations that will provide additional funded percentage to us. Lastly, as we continue and we'll be monitoring inflation, we will be looking at salary changes and FTE growth based upon how many people we're bringing on that's increasing that liability, as well as changing the salary. When we look about those 5%, that does have an impact into our liability, which then adjusts our contribution. With that impact this year, it was about a $3.4 million increase that we did to that contribution, that stable contribution, to account for that salary market increase. And lastly is to monitor the Tier 3 growth. So because we stabilize out the payment, we do look at the growth of the Tier 3 of what affects the contribution into that unfunded liability payment to ensure that we're not over contributing to Tier 3 and not contributing the amount that is needed for the Tier 1, Tier 2 unfunded liability. So we'll continue to monitor that and see if we need to break and separate those out from a review standpoint of what that stabilized payment will be. So the last slide is showing that change. So the dotted line that you see here is what we came to you all last year with our funded status. As you can see, with the change of the increased salaries, the liabilities, it did have an impact to our funded status. We reduced the position where we thought we were going to be from last year's forecast. And because of those long-term changes with the change in the discount rate and so forth and the salary increases, we will continue to monitor this to make any changes as needed. So if the market does come through, so we had the negative 4.2%, we're projecting at the 1 to 2% this year. And then if we project out next year about 0% investment return based upon how the market deals, or if the country does hit the recession, we will be coming back to you and discussing additional ideas of how we will counteract that change in missed investments. So one of the topics that we have in this forecast, if we do meet those missed investment returns, is utilizing that stabilization fund of that 14, which would then be 16 million next year, to help boost up that contribution, that one as a one-time into the fund to move our position, as well as we will look at doing increases into the different plans to adjust that stabilized contribution to ensure we meet the 100% status. So next steps is for council to take action on adopting the PSPRS funding policy for Monday's council meeting. And then once that is adopted, we'll post that online, and then we'll be back next year to see how our position changed.
So Vice Mayor and Council and Sam, make sure you correct me if I say something wrong. So big picture is every year we have to come to council with a policy. And effectively the policy we have is we have this window to pay down the unfunded liability. Now we're at we're at the 19th year. And what we try to do from a budgeting standpoint is we try to establish as much as possible what we believe is a level payment that will, for the next 19 years, right? As opposed to where before it was kind of up and down and it was a challenge. So in order to establish that level payment, there's a lot of variables that go into play, and Sam was covering them, whether it's the investment return, whether it's the growth in the number of individuals being covered, their salary rates. So we try to take all that into consideration And then we have, and oftentimes, and sometimes we have to adjust, if you would, that rate or that amount of dollars we're going to contribute. And we're trying to keep it somewhat level so we can use it as a better, it's easier for budgeting purposes that we have a number that we can stick out into the future. Now, we have experienced in the past episodes where the change in policy at PSPRS or failure to get the returns we want, and then we get some very large financial impacts to our payments. And so that's why, aside from the PSPRS payment, we've also set aside a reserve, if you would, to be able to manage those episodes when that happens. And it's happened before. We're now at, what did we say, 14 million we've set aside?
Correct.
So we'll probably hold there. We put aside $2 million a year. So that's in addition to the 80+ million each year that we send to the PSPRS. But we have this reserve against times when we've experienced it where in 1 year, all of a sudden, our payment spikes up by 10 million or whatever. So we have that as a cushion against any times that may be extraordinary lack of returns, some change in the policy of the life, just even the life expectancy of a member can change all these variables. So that is our policy. Our policy is to have level payments through 19 years as much as possible. Obviously, we have to keep tweaking them. We're telling you today we're going to have to increase that amount going out for the next 19 years. We have a policy to have this reserve in place against time periods when there may be great fluctuations. So that's kind of the essence, high level, of the policy that we come to you, the council, each year at this time. So hopefully that helps. Thank you.
Yes. Any questions?
Go ahead if they.
I have a question.
Yeah, Councilmember Goforth?
I just wondered, is that stabilization fund required by law, or do we just do it?
No, it's just been a practice of ours after going through some times when we got hit with some pretty significant cost, unexpected, and it was difficult to absorb in a budget. And so we've kind of took the initiative to just set aside $2 million a year and let that grow against those times when we might need it.
Councilmember Duff or Mayor? No. Councilmember Freeman?
Thank you, Vice Mayor. So when I read through this agenda item, of course, I'm concerned about the investment returns, that we're looking at, because obviously that is the swing that we have to do and create the portfolio to the reserve fund there. But then we did have the increased salary growth, for those tier 1 and 2 personnel. And so we have to account for that. But just so everybody knows, this is legislative done. The state legislature, requires us to participate in this program. And so a lot of the funding mechanisms are set there. But then, you look at all the gains and losses that it's had over the years has caused us to create and put more monies into the program. One of the things I just made a note on is we're fortunate to have a $3.3 million increase for marijuana sales tax to put in here. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't have that money, right? I mean, it's kind of a blessing in disguise, but having that helps us to offset some of our payments there for any of the market adjustments. But I appreciate that. I made one other note here. Let me see if I can find it. My question was, what options are out there if we did not take the recommendations from staff from this presentation?
You'll have to make a payment. We're required to make a payment. I guess the question is whether you make this payment or another payment. If you make a lesser payment, that means you're going to have to make up for it down the road. So there's not a choice. There's a minimum number, and I don't know what that number is, that we have to make a payment on regardless. We make a payment higher than the minimum so that we can get to a stable level amount. If you pay the minimum, what it means is you're going to have to make up for that difference down the road, and then that's where we thought that was going to create tremendous stress on a future budget. So does anybody know what that minimum payment would have been?
Don't have it off the top of my head. We were projecting originally to be around 68 million.
Yeah.
But one thing to note on that, we made this change. We're in the second year currently and coming up on the third year of this change of payment status. One thing to note is if we continue the process that we were previously, we would be in about a 4% less funded status comparatively to where we are today because of that change.
And even future payments were in excess of $100 million, I recall. So we were trying to avoid that by just paying more now, early on as we can, so that, again, it's just from doing a budget, having that somewhat level number is better than backloading it on some future council into the future.
Well, it's just like having a mortgage payment or anything that we're doing.
Right.
We're doing that, in-house here. And so I appreciate, the reason I wanted the conversation is I appreciate having overpayment on what we're having to pay so that it decreases our interest rates and everything that we would have accrued in the long term. So that's why we're doing all, and it's going to save it's going to save our taxpayers money.
It will.
Yeah.
And one thing to note for this agenda item, what we're looking at today is just the adoption of the policy itself. We can adjust the recommendations as needed throughout the fiscal year. But for today, it's to adopt the policy of stating that here are our assets and liabilities and what the funding goal of the city is. We can come back and look at different funding options through the budget process or throughout the fiscal year if there's changes that need to be made.
Okay. Thank you.
Perfect.
Well, I just want to say I fully support the current funding policy.
Yep. I think there's consensus, so thank you. I appreciate the presentation, and if there's any other questions, we'll move forward. I think which one you?
So, yes, Vice Mayor, the other presentation we have is actually on the special council meeting related to the secondary property tax. So if we're done with this.
I do have a couple
Yeah.
of questions on the agenda.
Okay.
So when I was reading through the agenda, 4A was the purchase of fire trucks.
Yes.
And so I talked to Chief Johnson a little bit prior. Come on up, Chief, about kind of the nuances of, 3 years to build a fire truck when, and then we're building new fire stations. So what I wanted to make sure is, as we're building our new fire stations, that we had ample apparatus, reserve apparatus to put in there until the new apparatus arrives. Reserve apparatus, I guess, Chief.
Vice Mayor, Councilmember Freeman, thank you for the question. James Johnson, Assistant Chief, Mesa Fire. Yes, to your question, we do have reserve units available for those stations that are coming up. When we were getting our new pumpers in the previous few years, we have held on to those. Typically, we will get rid of them, but we've held on to them for these cases because of these extended times of 3 years build times. So we do have that covered, and we are frustrated as well with the build times, but it's the world we live in. I was just talking to Mike Lewis, and they're seeing the same thing with their specialized vehicles. So it's not specific to just fire.
Okay. And I know these trucks aren't cheap, so
Correct.
they're very expensive, and the time to build and the components there. So just for my information, we're getting a pumper truck base price is almost $1 million each,
Yes, sir.
and then the ladder truck would be 1.8 mil, right
Yes,
in that
sir.
area, plus tax. So anyway, that's all I had. I just want to make sure, Chris, that we
Yeah, no, it's a great
trucks
question.
and stuff.
We're having the
as
same
for our
issue
growth.
with garbage trucks too. We have to order them
Talking about it.
way out ahead of time, so, yeah.
And then 5D, I just want to applaud staff for reaching out with SRP, Power District, on PPAs and participating in the programming there to, increase not only electricity, but water supplies to our streams and lakes. So that's a really good thing. And then my last one was on 8A, regulations regarding the park. This would be police changing the Mesa City Code. about marijuana in parks, and I was thinking, what type of citation would someone receive?
Oh, by a park ranger?
Yeah, in the parks, do we know what type of citation? Would that, just so that they show up in municipal court, city court?
Yeah, this was just to clarify that the park rangers could make the same citations that the officers can make. When we passed the marijuana regulations, whatever it was a couple years ago, that also gave us the tax that helped pay for the PSPRS that you commented about. We didn't include, we were very specific and said that sworn officers could enforce that. And so we wanted to go back and the rangers wanted to be able to make the same sort of citations that are in, that are occurring within the parks, smoking. And so that's all it does. It really just clarifies something. And they wanted it, instead of making the change within the marijuana ordinance, the rangers wanted it within their code so that their citations sort of, they could cite straight out of their own code and they don't have to refer to another code. So that's all it's doing. It's literally adding one sentence.
Okay, good, thank you. And I know park rangers have a lot of contact in our parks versus sworn officers. I mean, they're there all the time checking, so. Great, thank you, that's all.
Perfect. Is there any other questions on the agenda? Councilmember Duff.
Yes, a couple of things. On item 6A, on the Exhibit A attachment, I think there just needs to be a correction on line number 2 and omit the words pilot program.
Yes, you're correct. That was our whole.
Okay.
Is that right, Scott? Are you good with that? Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that's a good catch, yes.
Okay, and then I have a question on item 6B. So we're omitting our wastewater impact fees, but don't we have a lot of future projects and capital expenditures in this? Why, I just don't understand why the removal.
Do you want me to start?
Go ahead.
So when there was a change in legislation, it was almost a decade ago on the impact fee statute, there were sort of two options on the impact fees. One is that you could adopt a sort of forward-looking impact fee and go through a detailed study to look for impacts, and then that was subject to many restrictions and trying to adopt that type of impact fee. The other alternative was to look at your debt and to base your impact fee to pay off past debt. That's what the city chose to do. And so now as we pay down debt and pay it off, then we remove an impact fee. So we haven't done this for a while, but for example, the library impact fee, I think the stormwater impact fee, a couple of the impact fees, the debt on those were paid off. And when the debt's paid off, we remove that impact fee because that's what the city chose. And then as we sort of, as all the debt is getting paid off, some future council may elect to switch and go to the other concept of impact fee, which has a number of restrictions and what I'll call the forward-looking impact fee, where you're collecting for future improvements.
We do have some items on our capital improvement projects. So you're saying those are looking forward and not in existence at this point?
So the impact fee is the impact fee as it's structured right now is structured off of debt and paying off the debt. And so once that debt's paid off, we have to remove that impact fee. We'd have to restructure all our impact fees if we wanted to go to looking at sort of capital projects going forward. And so the city is handling those projects in different ways. And so it's really sort of an election that the city made over a decade ago, or approximately a decade ago. And both options have sort of pluses and minuses, and this was sort of detailed with council many years ago on the benefits of paying down the debt.
Jim, what's the debt made of as far as, isn't it capital program?
Yeah, so it'd
Right.
be projects that were financed through bonds.
Through bonds.
In the past, yeah.
Okay.
In the past, it had to be financed as of the date of that date when the legislature had passed the legislation that I'll say severely restricted impact fees. And so that was the election that the city made back then.
Because, Councilmember Duff, your expression of trying to get development to pay for itself, we all agree with. We are just very constrained by state law about how we can do that. And so the choice, I don't remember when we made this decision years ago, about using, the simplest way back when we made the decision was to use the impact fees to pay down the existing debt that had been incurred to build out a lot of the infrastructure. Now, I believe we still have some categories where we still have impact fees that are still paying off some of the debt. But at some point, and we can get back to council on when we estimate that will be completed, we'll have to reconsider then the option of maybe looking at an impact fee based more on a formula going forward. I will tell you, based on the current status, the way the legislature set it up, trying to figure out how to describe it, it's not easy. It's a very complex, and we'll have to bring in consultants and to do it. Not to say we won't do it. I'm just saying we felt like the easiest and simplest way was to pay off the existing debt, and that's been fairly successful. We have been able to pay down quite a bit of debt just using impact fees. But now going forward, how does development pay for itself? Well, the legislature's made that very difficult to do, but we will have to have that conversation in the future.
Okay, well, thanks for the explanation. Thanks.
Any other questions on the agenda?
I have a question.
Councilmember Goforth?
On item 10, the capital improvement program, are we adopting that, taking a vote on June 5th, or is it open for public hearing? Is that for a time period?
Brian?
So thank you, Vice Mayor, Council, Brian Ritchell, Office of Management Director. So for the capital improvement, this is the adoption of the 5-year plan. So we do this, we come every year, as I mentioned, this is a plan. So this is kind of what the city is looking forward to in capital projects. So every year, as part of the charter, a 5-year plan needs to be adopted by council. And so really what the council is adopting in the annual budget is just the first year of that plan. There are usually changes to the capital improvement plan, depending on if projects slow up or there's timelines need to be changed or priorities changed. So it's really just approving that 5-year plan.
Okay, so Mr. Brady, you and I had a conversation about some of the categories being attributed to certain districts that may not be correct.
So yeah,
I believe those.
And that's still in here. So I don't know. That's why I was asking, do we have time to kind of go through and make sure that those are correct? And what's the significance of that?
so Vice Mayor, Councilmember Goforth, staff did go through that summary. I will look to see if it's the final one has been posted. The final one should be part of the agenda item itself. So unless there's some that were missed, but I believe when we reviewed it, we changed all the ones and corresponded them to like the new district boundaries and things like that. That got changed a couple of years ago. We went and revised those. So the one attached to the agenda item should be the final one that has the updated ones.
I think I'm looking at the final, but you might just take a peek at page 40, 41, that area, because I think I'm on the right attachment here for today, for the Monday's agenda. So
We'll take a look.
We'll take a look.
thanks.
Perfect. Any other questions, Mayor, on the council agenda? No? Thumbs up. And then I just see what number is this? 4C, the Channel 11 upgrades. I think that's,
We're replacing our homemade version.
yeah. It's good to see an upgrade there and moving that forward. So any questions? All right, we'll get to the other item.
So in the special council meeting, so if council remember on Monday, we'll have 2 meetings. We'll actually adjourn the first council meeting stay in your seats, and then we'll open up the special council meeting, which is required by state law for us to approve the budget in. But part of that special council meeting includes a public hearing on the secondary property tax. So maybe quickly, we'll have Ryan just come up.
Sure.
I think it's good news, but just to be in anticipation of that public hearing on Monday, I think it'd be helpful to hear from Ryan.
All right.
I'm sure there'll be community input on it.
Sure, well, I think they will like what they have to hear.
Good morning, Vice Mayor, Mayor, Council. I'm Ryan Wimmer. I'm the City Treasurer. I'm here to talk about property values and property tax for the upcoming fiscal year 2023 and 24, which starts on July 1st. So first looking at property values, each year each property in the city gets a couple valuations. The green bar here is it's called the limited property value. That's the value that is used for calculating property taxes. And it is, as the name implies, it's limited to a growth rate on existing property of 5% a year. And that's why, yeah, so you see that green bar's kind of a moderate rate of growth. The other value that each property receives is called the full cash value, and that is a percentage of the market value or sale value. The name's a little misleading because it sounds like it's the full value, but it's not. It's a percentage of what it would sell for, and that essentially just acts as a cap on the other value, on the limited property value, so that your taxable value can't go up above that full cash value.
So we're very fortunate there's a large difference between the limited property value and the full cash value, meaning that even in a downturn of values, we wouldn't lose ground on what the assessed valuation is currently being used. The green can only, despite the growth, you can see the growth in the full cash value has been fairly significant, which probably shouldn't surprise anybody. But regardless, the limited property value upon which we apply the tax rate is limited to a 5% growth. So you can see how that difference, but it's nice to have that difference just in case there were a downturn, we would still maintain the current limited property value that we have today and probably allow for a little bit of growth through the years.
One item to note is that these values, it's a pretty long process between when they read the values and when it gets implemented for property taxes. So it's a 2 to 3 year lag. And so, as Chris mentioned, the fiscal year 23-24 jump you see in that full cash value was a 29% increase for the value being used for next year. It's from fall of 2020 to fall of 2021. So the values for the appeal process and there's a state review, there's a long process, so it takes a while to get the values to actually hit the property tax process. So that's why you see that. That's from that boom back in 2020 and 21, that real estate boom. So this is kind of new information we added this year because there seemed to be quite a bit of interest, but you see this is the median residential property values in Mesa. So when we say median, if you were to line up all the properties from lowest value to highest value, it would be the middle value. So it's the midpoint of the values. And these are just residential, but you have the same values here. The green bars are the limited property value, which is the one used for taxes that can only go up by 5% on existing property. Then you have the blue bar, which is the full cash value, which is based off of market value. It's a percentage of market value, and it's just a cap on the green value. And then we came up with, knowing the methodology that is used to come up with the full cash value, we came up with this sale value. And this is just my estimate, not the counties or the states, but it's fairly accurate, I believe. So if you look in 23-24, you can see that same upswing in the year coming up from fall of 20 to 21. So the red bar would be the estimated sale value, and in Mesa, the median estimated sale value from fall of 20 to fall of 2021 that's being used for fiscal year 23-24 is almost 400,000. It's 396,000. For comparison, Gilbert's value, that same estimated sale value would be 503,000. Chandler's would be 473,000. And that compares to the Mesa value of 396. We have already the preliminary values for the following fiscal year, which would be fiscal year 24-25, which are based on the valuations from a few years ago, meaning fall of 21 to fall of 22. So these are more current. But Mesa's value, estimated sale value, goes up to 467,000 as for the median residential property, and that compares to 593 for Gilbert and 545 for Chandler. So hopefully these numbers, when you look at the sale value, make some sense as far as thinking about where the market is. When you look at just at the assessed values from the assessor's office, it's hard to understand because they're really the sale value of the properties. So the taxable value this year, or I'm sorry, going into fiscal year 23-24, the taxable value is increasing 6.7% in total. And I just want to make the point that 2.5% of that, roughly a third of that, is from new property, which means construction or purchase of heavy equipment. So a lot of growth happening. You can think of all the construction happening in the city, and that's showing up in these numbers for next fiscal year's taxable property value. We'll move on to property taxes if anyone, if there's no questions on property values.
Any questions? No.
Okay, great. So there's a couple types of property taxes that exist. The city does not have a primary property tax for general operations, but it does have a secondary property tax for payments on general obligation bonds. And general obligation bonds require an election, require voters to approve the bonds. And you can see on this table, these are the general obligation bond elections the city that voters have approved, and these are all the ones, all the bond questions that the city has put up to voters since 2008, and those for those purposes listed. Each of those bond election questions includes the statement down there below, taken from the 2022 ballot, that says in that highlighted little section there, to be repaid with secondary property taxes. So it's clear that these bonds pass and they're going to be repaid with this secondary property tax. So this slide, this table shows the comparison of the levy, the values and the rate and the levy from the current year, fiscal year 22-23, to next fiscal year 23-24. And if we look at the current fiscal year first, the property valuation, taxable property, was $4.2 billion. The tax rate was 91 cents per $100 of taxable value, and that generates a tax levy of $38.8 million, and that's the amount we need to make the payment on the general obligation bonds. And the annual cost to the median homeowner or the median residential property owner is $146, and that's this year. So going into next year, what we're proposing is values went up by $4.5 billion. That's the number we received from the county. That's the 6.7% taxable value change. The tax rate, since the taxable value went up, the tax rate is being dropped by a similar amount, by 6.3% to 85 cents, and that gives us the same levy of $38.8 million. So we're proposing the same levy as last year. It's a lower rate because values are higher, and the median homeowner impact is slightly less at $145.
So Mayor and Council, one of the things that we want to be clear about, because sometimes there's discussions about property taxes in the community, we only levy a rate we only apply the tax rate onto the amount we actually need each year to pay off the secondary property tax. We don't do anything more than just what we can cover for the levy.
To pay off the general obligation.
Pay off the
bonds.
general obligation bonds. Now, that 38.8 million is the same as it was last year. It'll change in the coming years, but every year we will do this same calculation. We'll get the property tax value that we can apply a rate to, and then we'll find the rate that is needed to generate the levy to get to that amount. Now, the good news this year, because we've kept the levy the same, and because values have gone up, the rate can come down. Now, out into the future, there will be some growth in that tax levy, and we'll just have to see, again, an application of what's going to happen with the taxable property value. Based on the charts we've just seen, most likely it will continue to grow. But that rate doesn't always going to keep coming down, because if the levy goes up, there'll probably be some slight adjustments. But I believe this is at least the second year that we've reduced the tax rate. Does that sound right? I know we did last year.
That's right.
So we've done at least 2 years in a row. And that's just that's a sign of a good, healthy economy, where we're seeing new construction adding to the value, and we're seeing obviously values across the board, property values across the board increasing also.
And Vice Mayor, if I can make one other point on this slide before we move on. If you see the tax rate is down 6.3% for next fiscal year, if you remember, existing properties can only, taxable values can only increase by 5% a year. So that means, since the rate is decreasing by more than that, every existing property in the city of Mesa will receive a lower tax bill in fiscal year 23-24 than in fiscal year 22-23. So everyone in the city can look forward to that small reduction. This is a
You can say it.
this is a table that compares. It looks at the past, the present, and the future of the levy and the rate. The blue bars are the levy, and what Chris was just talking about. If you look at the 23-24 proposed, which is what we're proposing for next fiscal year, it's flat from this fiscal year 22-23. This fiscal year was a significant reduction from 21-22 in the levy, and so this is the second year of this lower levy that Chris was referring to. But you see, in future years, we still have bonds from 2008. The 2018 bond election to the 2020 bond election, and we just had a bond election this past year for public safety in 2022. As those bonds are issued in the future, the levy, we do anticipate the levy will rise, and the rate, not right away, but as that debt gets issued, the rate will also rise above the current level. We expect the levy to peak in fiscal year 28-29. And then that drop in fiscal year 29-30 is where we usually issue 20-year debt, and so that's where the original 2008 bonds start to drop off from the original use of the secondary property tax back in 2010-ish. So that's 20 years later, where that debt starts to be paid off.
All right, we have a question.
So Chris and Ryan, help me understand. We only raise our levy rate based on the monies we spend, even though we went out for a bond election, and so that rate increases as we spend that money, because then we're accountable for that bond money.
Yeah, we only, just think of it, we apply a rate that's necessary to generate what we owe in our debt payment.
Yeah.
Right?
Even though we have outstanding bond monies that we haven't used.
Yes, and so Ryan does a good job of trying to, and he has to adjust this over time periods, but he looks out, that's why we do the 5-year, when we do a bond program, we do a 5-year kind of drawdown, and he looks at that, looks at how the spend rate is and how fast we're spending those bond dollars, and then obviously that dictates each year how much we're going to go to the market to sell bonds, and then he makes those adjustments in these charts.
Good. Thank you.
On that, is the forecast based on what we have in the books right now, or is there the anticipation of having additional bonds next year?
Vice Mayor, that's a good question. This chart does not anticipate the 2024 GO bond election or any following bond election. It only includes the existing approved authorizations from 18, 20, and 22.
So those next year, if we have a bond or 2 years from now, we'll
Right.
see an adjustment.
We would
to that
come, and one of the
forecast.
things we would do is part of sizing, that's part of the discussion with council about a future bond is, well, how much?
Sure.
And then Ryan helps us in working with our financial advisors and say, okay, well, it's this much, and I spread it out over the next 20 years. How will that impact these amounts in the future? And we'll have that conversation because we always want to be very clear, and we always do this every time we have a bond election. We tell and what's in the publicity pamphlets, it's everywhere, we say, these bonds could result in an increase in your property tax payment by X dollars. And so we will do those calculations when we get to those discussions, probably in the fall.
Mayor?
Thank you. Ryan, does this forecast, it sounds like it incorporates the anticipated bond sales that have already been authorized, but does it also anticipate ongoing real estate development? When the Metas and Googles and all these other really very high value properties come online, is that reflected in this chart as well?
You make an assumption about growth. What is that?
Right. Vice Mayor and Mayor, this forecast assumes a 6% annual property tax value growth. That, and you saw in a prior slide, 6.7% this coming year. It was 6.1% the year before. It's been around above 6% for about 6 or 7 years. So a big portion of that is that growth, that 2.4% this year of growth. So yeah, it does not specifically, but it does in general assume a continued growth of property values. Pretty. It's not too conservative. I'd say 6% is fairly realistic, given all the development that's still in the pipeline and that has yet to hit the rolls.
Okay, thank you. And is the tax rate uniform throughout the city on all types of property? Are residential properties and commercial properties taxed at the same rate?
Vice Mayor and Mayor, it is, so the city's tax rate is uniform, but commercial properties are assessed a higher assessment ratio, it's called. So there's the different categories of property. The big three are residential, commercial, and agricultural. And like residential property has an assessment ratio of 10%. If you've ever heard of that, they take your limited property value and they apply a 10% assessment ratio, and then that's your taxable value. Commercial property is higher; it's at 17%. And so when the commercial property has its limited property value, to get to the taxable value, it's a higher ratio that's taxed.
So Ryan, the answer is the rate's the same.
Yes.
But where the adjustments are made are on the assessed values. There's all kinds of
Yes.
different formulas that, whether it's residential, commercial, I think there's even like seniors, there's different adjustments to the base value. That's where the adjustments are made. Our rate is uniform across, but what the value is being applied, what that's being applied to in the value can be adjusted based on all kinds of formulas the states come up with. Is that fair?
Yes, and also, Vice Mayor, Mayor, also to remember, as far as city tax, that's the case, and then people live in different school districts or CFDs or special taxing districts that have different rates as well. So,
Yeah, good point. Good point.
And I assume to that question, sorry, Mayor, to that question, the cost of that property also has a pressure on how much, right? Or is that going to affect as far as a property being valued more than other properties in our city?
Vice Mayor, you're saying the cost, like what it sells for?
What it sells for, yeah.
Yeah, so the valuation, the county doesn't take into account like the actual sale of that property in its valuation.
Okay.
It just takes into account all the comparable sales for a property like that, like a single-family residential, one story in this area. So that's a good question. It doesn't.
It doesn't, okay.
Yeah. it
A
doesn't.
single transaction is not
It's
going to
not.
make that difference.
Okay.
Right.
All right. Bear, sorry.
Oh, no, thank you. The details of the formulas that are used to draw the distinctions between ag and commercial and residential, is that all set by the state, or does the city play any role in that?
Vice Mayor, yeah, that's set by the state. Yep, it is. And the commercial rate, just of note, you might be interested, it's actually being reduced right now by 0.5% every year. So when the Arizona State Legislature talks about cutting taxes for businesses, property taxes, that's what they're doing. They're lowering that assessment ratio. When I started doing this, it was 20%. Now it's 17. It's going, it was 17.5. It's going to 16.5. It's going down to 15% over the next 5 years or whatever. So the legislature sets those, and they do play with them to give tax breaks.
All right. Councilmember Duff?
I just had one question overall on our bonding. So what is our limitation in exercising the previously approved bonds? We have bonds from 2018 that have not been exercised fully. Is it just in our personnel and staff, engineering? Is it, do we put limitations on how much debt we want to incur in a single year?
Yeah.
I get questions from the constituents. We approved that in 2018. Why hasn't anything been done?
Great, thank you, Councilmember Duff. So the answer is, even when we approve a bond, when we go to the voters with a bond package, we always talk about it being a 5-year program. There's just no way that we take a $100+ million bond package and we're going to get it done in 1 year. So that's one factor. We always look at it over a 5-year period. We talk about and we place those projects spread out over 5 years. So that's the first part. And a lot of that is driven not only by our capacity to build out all those projects, and we only go to the voters once or 4 or 5 years anyway, but we also use it, and Ryan uses it to give us an estimate based on that 5-year program. Then he can use that and put that into his model here and talk about the impacts that will have on the tax levy, which talks about the tax rate and how much that's going to impact the average homeowner. In addition, then when the CIP is being built, one of the purposes of that CIP is not just anticipating what projects are coming and how they're going to get funded, but also we look at it on what impacts it's going to have on operations. So especially like, for example, fire stations. We look at a fire station and we spread those out because we recognize not only the time it takes to build it, but also the impact of staffing a fire station. And, it's just ordering a pumper, running, getting the academies up so we can have the number of firefighters ready to staff those positions. But that has an impact on the operational budget. So all of those are factors in the timing of projects. And then most recently, over the last 2-3 years, we've been impacted by supply chain issues. Increasing cost of construction have significantly impacted projects where we've had to hold back until we could identify additional funding. So I think if someone goes back and looks at our presentations, every time we've presented these bond programs, we've talked about them being implemented out over a 4 or 5 year period. I know people get anxious, but that's kind of the plan. And then we try to stick with that plan. Now, again, I'll admit over the last couple of years, we've probably had some slippage just because literally we can't get supplies, we can't get contractors out, but I think things are going on a little bit better. But anyway, that's a long answer to a lot of things going to that factor of the timing of capital projects.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. I think that's,
Yeah.
oh yeah, you got that
So
slide.
just the last slide with the final steps in the budget adoption property tax process for the year. On Monday, you'll hold a public hearing on the annual budget and secondary property tax levy, and then consider final adoption of the annual budget. And on June 19th, so 2 weeks later, you'll consider adoption of the secondary property tax levy.
And that change, the change on the tax goes in July, or, yep,
Yes, Vice Mayor, the tax rate and the tax levy are going into effect, yes, July 1st.
July 1st. Perfect. Any other questions? Comments? Hearing none? All right, thank you, Ryan. Any other, Mr. Brady? No? Any last call for any other items on the council agenda for Monday? Hearing none, we'll go to number 2, current events. Any council members have anything to share? Councilmember Duff?
Of course I have to share. On Saturday, I attended Mate Game, Save the Planet prototype showing. It was a metaverse video game that some high school students created under the leadership of ASU professor. And they illustrated the future of a water shortage and how it impacts the society. And they're continuing to work on this, so the game will be completed in about a year. So it was very interesting to see the perspective of young people on our water supplies and in a metaverse or video game environment. Right now, I and Councilmember Goforth are in Charlotte, North Carolina. Yesterday, we attended the Strong Towns Gathering, and that's in conjunction with the CNU, which is the Congress for New Urbanism Conference. It started yesterday, and I've attended the sessions on infill development, city economics, and the housing crisis. And the last thing I'd like to say is today is June 1st, and happy Pride Month. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Duff. Anybody else? Mayor?
Thank you. I'm out of town today, obviously, as well, at the U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting in Columbus, Ohio. Looking forward to some talking about Mesa and a couple of speaking opportunities. So I'll come back and give a full report on Monday. But a lot of us were, I think, Vice Mayor, in your district, I hope you'll talk about the Desert Challenge Games on Friday. And on last Sunday, I was honored to help recognize Pastor David Wade at the Mount Calvary Church for his 25 years of service to the community. And so congratulations to Mount Calvary and Pastor Wade. And then not to be outdone by Councilmember Duff and her Whataburger announcement last week, I just want to make sure that everyone knows that there's a brand new Dunkin' Donuts at Mesa Drive in Southern. And I was happy to cut the ribbon there. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Councilmember Goforth?
Sorry. Yes, I attended the Desert Challenge along with you and the mayor, and that was great. That was a great event to watch and be a part of. And then, as Councilmember Duff said, I am here in Charlotte with her at the Congress for New Urbanism Learning, and hopefully bringing back a lot of great ideas for development projects. So happy to be here.
Perfect. Councilmember Freeman?
Yeah, thank you. So I had the opportunity to ride in the Mesa Police helicopter this past week and talk about an exhilarating experience. And their flight crew, our Mesa Police sworn and civilian personnel, are just awesome. And so I learned, I said, so if we're at Riverview, how long will it take to fly to East Marker Cadence? And they said 5 to 6 minutes. So that's their response time. And having them in the air is so beneficial to the officers on the ground. And they were very resilient, and they enjoy what they're doing. I can't imagine why, but they had a great time. So did I, pretty windblown in the back. But learned a lot there. And so I thank you to that public safety crew and all that they do. Thanks, Vice Mayor.
Perfect. And I know today is Dinosaur Day at the Arizona History Museum, so I know they have a lot of events and activities for everybody to come by and stop by. So stop by our downtown and enjoy Dinosaur Day. So
Do we get to feed them?
maybe, we'll see. But anything else? Hearing none. Scheduled meetings, Mr. Brady?
Yes, just a reminder, we have a council meeting on Monday. I think we will keep to our 5:15 start, but we do have a presentation on the transit master plan that will be presented. I think it seemed like this agenda went okay, so we'll have time to do that for Monday afternoon. And then I also have an announcement. It looks like this Saturday, June 3rd, from 6 to 9 p.m. at the Plaza here at Mesa City Center. There'll be an outdoor movie and food trucks.
Nice.
So invite everybody to come out for that.
Perfect. Well, thank you. I ask for a motion to adjourn. Mr. Freeman, Councilmember Duff, all in favor say aye.
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 We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Have a good morning.